Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. Press Center of UCMC started its work, and the topic of the first press briefing, presentation of the final report of the Ukrainian World Congress on parliamentary elections in Ukraine on July 21st, 2019. Our speaker is Eugene Czolij, head of the international mission of Ukraine World Congress on observation elections 2019 in Ukraine. Welcome. Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eugene Czolij, and I am the head of the Ukrainian World Congress, International Observation Mission to Ukraine's 2019 elections, or UWC mission. I have the pleasure to present to you the final report of the UWC mission regarding the early parliamentary election in Ukraine on the 21st of July 2019. The Ukrainian World Congress, or UWC, is the international coordinating body for Ukrainian communities in the diaspora, representing the interests of over 20 million Ukrainians. The UWC has a network of member organizations and ties with Ukrainians in over 60 countries. Founded in 1967, the UWC was recognized in 2003 by the United Nations Economic and Social Council as a non-governmental organization with a special consultative status, and obtained in 2018 participatory status as an international non-governmental organization with the Council of Europe. On the 11th of July 2019, the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation declared the UWC to be an undesirable organization, constitutes a threat to the constitutional order and security of the Russian Federation. Since 1999, the UWC has deployed election observation missions to monitor all presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine. The UWC mission was the fourth largest international observation mission to the parliamentary election in Ukraine after the observation missions of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, the European Network of Election Monitoring Organization, ANEMO, and the Canadian Mission Canada. The UWC mission focused on the following: commenting on the legal framework of the electoral process, particularly on Ukraine's domestic legislation and legal norms, as well as Ukraine's commitments to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Council of Europe, and to the other international standards for democratic elections. Intelligence gathering on Ukraine's preparedness to ensure democratic elections and to counteract possible foreign interference, including cyber attacks, manipulations, and violations of the electoral process. Third, media monitoring around the world and in different languages in order to detect any attempts to undermine Ukraine during this election year, including the integrity of Ukraine's electoral processes and the legitimacy of its democracy. The fourth one, observing the electoral process in the days leading up to and on election day, as well as the counting and transfer of ballot boxes to the Central Election Commission from polling stations in Ukraine and the Ukrainian diplomatic missions around the world where voting took place. The UWC mission issued 4 reports on parliamentary election. Interim report on the 18th of July, preliminary observations on the 22nd of July, the day after the election, preliminary observations on media monitoring on the 24th of July, and today, on the 2nd of September, we have final report. The UWC mission was completely independent and didn't receive any government funding. The Central Election Commission of Ukraine accredited 163 domestic observer organizations with 17,187 observers. In addition, the CEC accredited 21 international organizations with 1,602 observers. On the 7th of February 2019, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted a law that bans Russian citizens from participating as observers in the presidential and parliamentary elections. This affected the UWC mission in that it excluded citizens of Russian Federation that are members of UWC member organizations from joining the UWC mission. For Ukraine's parliamentary election, the UWC mission registered with the CEC 142 short-term observers from 30 countries. The UWC mission also closely cooperated with the observation mission of its member organization, Ukrainian Congress Committee on America, UCCA, which registered 32 short-term observers. Together, the UWC and UCCA missions registered 174 short-term observers with the CEC. UWC short-term observers completed online and in-person training on the 20th of July in Kiev. The online reporting system for UWC short-term observers was developed by the Sterling Business School. The UWC mission monitored the electoral process in 20 oblasts of Ukraine. In addition, the UWC mission monitored the voting in Ukraine's diplomatic missions in 23 countries. The UWC and UCCA missions were the only international missions that monitored the electoral process in Ukraine's diplomatic missions around the world. The UWC mission also mobilized 125 long-term observers from 28 countries, and UWC long-term observers conducted media monitoring in 20 languages for any evidence of information. UWC long-term observers began their activities on the 2nd of March 2019 with a training session conducted by experts from Stop Fake and the Kiev-Mogila Academy School of Journalism. The long-term media monitoring with respect to the parliamentary election started on 14th of June 2019. The UWC long-term observation mission was unique since the UWC long-term observers monitored the media in the countries of residence of potential disinformation. The UWC long-term observers were completed online training on the specifics of the media environment during the election period and on submitting online reports. The online reporting system was developed in partnership with Sterling Business School and in consultation with the representatives of Stop Fake and Kiev-Mogila Academy School of Journalism. The 2019 parliamentary election in Ukraine took place on the heels of the 5th anniversary of Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity and the invasion by the Russian Federation of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, including the illegal occupation of Crimea and subsequently parts of the eastern Ukrainian territory of the Donbas. On the day of the parliamentary election, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission recorded 79 ceasefire violations in eastern Ukraine. The conclusions of the UWC mission are based upon the direct observations of its short-term observers and meetings held with high-level officials from state institutions and representatives of the media, civil society, and the international community. The UWC mission has assessed the parliamentary election considering Ukraine's international commitments to democracy, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and to free and fair elections. UWC short-term observers recorded minor irregularities in certain polling stations, including the challenge for elderly and physically disabled people to access polling stations located on second and third floors. These irregularities were not systemic. It didn't impact on the election results. The governing authorities, particularly the CEC and the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, ensured the integrity and security of the electoral process despite the ongoing hybrid aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. In fact, Russian hybrid aggression against Ukraine had the worst impact on the 2019 parliamentary election in Ukraine, since it did not allow the Ukrainian people to elect 12 MPs in Crimea and 14 MPs on the occupied territories of the Donbas. Based on the monitoring results of the UWC mission, the 2019 parliamentary election in Ukraine has met international standards for conduct of democratic elections. The UWC mission also did long-term media monitoring in order to demonstrate the level of disinformation among the international community regarding Ukraine and its electoral process. On the 3rd of November 2015, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Benjamin Ziff testified as follows before the Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Citation: "The Kremlin sponsors these efforts with a sophisticated $1 billion $400 million a year propaganda apparatus at home and abroad, which claims to reach 600 million people across 130 countries in 30 languages. The Russian government also funds think tanks and outside organizations in its neighboring states to help achieve its goals on promoting the Kremlin's false narratives, portraying the West as a threat, and undermining trust to independent media as well as Western institutions and values." This is end of quote. In the case of Ukraine, disinformation has been and remains an integral part of Russian hybrid warfare, which includes the military, economic, cyber, and information components. The ultimate goal of Russian hybrid warfare, including disinformation, is to weaken Ukraine in order to return it to the Russian sphere of influence and domination. Effectively drawing on its international and multilingual network of diaspora communities, the UWC mission has detected numerous examples of Russian disinformation about Ukraine and its electoral processes in foreign media. The UWC mission has noted various disinformation narratives during Ukraine's parliamentary election, which have been disseminated in various languages through traditional and social media outside of Ukraine. The target audience has been the international community with different degrees of involvement with Ukraine. Some of the disinformation narratives uncovered by the long-term observers of the UWC mission include the following. On the 7th of June, the website Mediapart published in English, and on the 8th of June, the Uawc site reposted in French an article entitled, quote, "Do French taxpayers sponsor the Ukrainian conflict?" End of quote, which states, Quote, all these events are causing more and more protest by ordinary French taxpayers who ask whether France is financing the Ukrainian war in Donbass and outright anti-Russian propaganda. End of quote. This article propagates the false information that is Ukraine that is waging war against the Russian Federation and Donbass and spreading anti-Russian propaganda, and that the French taxpayers are financing such efforts. On the 14th of June, the online newspaper L'Humanité published in French an article entitled Ukraine, Zelensky, and After, end of quote, which states the following. I cite, the euphoria of the overwhelming victory of the Novy Zelensky should not overshadow the emergence of a nationalist, anti-Russian, and xenophobic extreme right, which served the post-Maidan Ukrainian power. Thus, the most disturbing phenomenon is the rise of neo-Nazi radical ideologies in the heart of a former communist state. The lessons of history have not been retained. End of quote. This article repeats the false accusation that the governing authorities of Ukraine are radical and xenophobic. On the 4th of July, the Uawc site published in French an article entitled The Collapse of Power in Ukraine Has Begun, which states the following, the quote, the devaluation of the presidential power further accelerates the disintegration of the Ukrainian state. If the president is considered a puppet, there will be commotion and disintegration. And this agitation takes shape in the battles around the composition of the Verkhovna Rada. In Ukraine, the oligarchs who, through the president, already have contractual relations with each other and with foreign heads of state, are governing more and more openly. Ukraine, which previously had no sovereignty, is now openly transformed into a fuzzy territory whose mandate is exercised by outside actors, and it is they who determine whether or not to start disintegration of the territory of Ukraine. End of quote. This article attempts not only to belittle the presidential power and the new composition of the Verkhovna Rada, but also to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. On the 21st of July, Russia Today featured in French a video entitled Parliamentary Elections in Ukraine, Landslide Victory for the Party of President Zelensky, end of quote, which propagated the following narratives. Quote, we need to be clear, reforms that are prepared in Ukraine are not decided in Ukraine. Zelensky is only a puppet. 10 million citizens living in Russia cannot go to vote this time. Results of the elections do not matter, given the fact that decisions are anyway taken elsewhere. And the problem is to know who you talk to if you speak to a president whose country is under foreign occupation. And here I'm not speaking about Russia. End of quote. This video perpetuates surreptitiously the disinformation that Ukraine is not a sovereign state and that the citizens of Ukraine living on the territory of the Russian Federation could not vote, even though they could exercise their right to vote in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland. On the 21st of July, Russia 24 channel hosted a talk show in Russian called, I cite, Sunday Evening, end of quote, where the host mentioned that, I quote, a phenomenal number of Ukrainians did not have the possibility to vote in parliamentary elections. It was a dirty electoral campaign with colossal pressure, end of quote. And also that Russia, this is quote, Russia should not recognize the parliamentary elections in Ukraine because there were no Russian observers, no PAC observers. There were clear violations in the electoral campaign. It would be unwise to call these elections representative, free, or fair. End of quote. This disinformation is clearly contradicted by international missions that monitored this parliamentary election in Ukraine. On the 22nd of July, commenting on an interview with a political scientist on Russia 24 TV channel, the English language website Fort Russ calls Ukraine a playground for political experiments, claiming that, I quote, Ukraine's senior partners in Washington determined the brink of what is possible, huddling the Ukrainian political characters into a special corridor of possibility. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, to stay in line with the promised election slogans during their campaigns, end of quote. This article plainly disinforms that Ukraine is not a sovereign state country, but simply a political experiment of Washington. On the 22nd of July, the information agency Regnum published in Russian an article entitled, quote, "The Rada elections have been called the most closed in history," end of quote, which quotes a Russian official as saying that I cite, the elections to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on the 21st of July were the most closed ones in the entire history of the Republic. Judging by the number of violations, on the 22nd of July, procedures cannot be called an election, end of quote. This article falsely accentuates that the violations on the 21st of July were so severe that one cannot even call Ukraine's parliamentary election an election, notwithstanding that international observation missions declared that the same election has met the international standards for the conduct of democratic elections. On the 25th of July, an English-language article in the Seika blog entitled Zelensky's Dilemma asserted that, I quote, "The sad reality is that the Nazi occupation of the Ukraine has turned the country into a prototypical failed state, and that there are no signs of any kind of indicating that things might get better, even marginally, for the foreseeable future," end of quote. This assertion is completely divorced from the political reality in Ukraine and the law of Ukraine on the condemnation of the communist and National Socialist Nazi regimes and prohibition of propaganda of their symbols, which prevents the nomination of a candidate for a member of parliament of Ukraine by a party that disseminates the propaganda of communist or national socialist totalitarian regimes or their symbols. On the 19th of August, the Cont site posted an article stating the following, Quote, "It is not for the first time that it becomes clear that the future of the Ukrainian people today is not determined in Kiev, not in the Verkhovna Rada, but in the USA and Europe, those countries served by the servants of the people." This article attempts to underhandedly discredit Ukraine's sovereignty. In sharp contrast to many of the aforementioned narratives, the preliminary assessments by reputable international observation missions, including the ODIHR, OSCE, NDM, NDI, and the European Parliament, have unequivocally signaled that Ukraine conducted a fully democratic election. For example, ODIHR-OSCE, quote, "Ukraine's early parliamentary elections were efficiently run and respected fundamental freedoms." And ammo, quote, "Elections were held in a competitive and generally peaceful environment, despite tight deadlines and remaining shortcomings in the legislation. Election administration functioned in an overall transparent and efficient manner." Canada. Ukrainians have affirmed their commitment to democratic development by electing a new parliament in an election that largely met international democratic standards. NDI. For the third time in 4 months, Ukraine held democratic elections. Despite a war and the punishing timeline, government officials, election administrators, political parties, candidates, election observers, and citizens collectively delivered an election that complied with the Ukraine's laws, meets international standards, and reflects the will of voters. This is a remarkable achievement. End of quote. The European Parliament election observation delegation to Ukraine stated, "One can undoubtedly say that the elections, were competitive, well administered, and managed in an efficient way." On the basis of the long-term media monitoring and analysis, the UWC mission affirms the existence of widespread disinformation about the parliamentary election and Ukraine in general. The UWC mission also makes the following recommendations to improve Ukraine's electoral process. Recommendations based on the short-term monitoring of the UWC mission. First, abolish the day of silence as an outdated procedure which does not take into account the significant role of social networks which have remained off-limits to such a regulation. Second, provide equal conditions for political parties and candidates in the media space, which would include equal airtime and uniform representation. Third, explore new initiatives that would simplify the participation of Ukrainian voters abroad, some of whom had to travel very long distances in order to cast a vote during the parliamentary election. Such mechanisms may include voting by mail, electronic voting, telephone voting, and increasing the number of polling stations in foreign constituencies. This would increase the voter turnout outside of Ukraine, in as much as it only reached 14% during the parliamentary election. The UWC mission points out that electronic voting includes the following elements: internet voting through the use of a computer at designated kiosks, any polling station or the voters' precinct polling station, and remote internet voting from an internet-connected computer anywhere in the world. Estonia became the first country to use remote internet voting in its parliamentary election, which took place in 2007. Voters logged into the system using an ID card and cast their ballot. During the 2015 parliamentary election, Estonian voters from 116 countries in the world were able to cast their ballot via the internet. In the 2019 Estonian parliamentary election, about 44% of all votes were cast online. The biggest concerns with electronic voting remain computer viruses and hacker attacks, as well as the high expense for the installation of a reliable electronic voting system. Recommendations based on the long-term monitoring of the UWC mission. They are the following. The Ukrainian authorities, civil society, and the UWC should continue raising awareness of the serious threats that disinformation poses for political stability, socio-economic well-being, and fundamental freedoms. Second, conceive a strategic program for combating disinformation. Third, set up a commission which will coordinate the various stakeholders involved in the process of preventing, detecting, analyzing, and combating disinformation and its side effects. Fourth one, create a monitoring group consisting of diaspora representatives who will continue monitoring on a permanent basis traditional and social media in their countries of residence for manipulation and disinformation about Ukraine generally and its democratic processes in particular. Fifth, establish channels of cooperation with governments of Western countries and international organizations to share experiences and data so as to effectively counter Russian disinformation and to coordinate the struggle against this destructive phenomenon at the global level. 6. Identify effective ways of engaging with Google, YouTube, social media such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and the communication platform WhatsApp in developing the means to counteract the spread of Russian and other disinformation. 7th, invest in increasing media awareness among Ukrainian citizens, including the issues of disinformation and manipulation through specialized training and the inclusion of critical thinking and media literacy courses in school and academic curricula. 8th, facilitate the development of independent and high-quality media which would effectively disseminate accurate information about Ukraine to different target audiences and in different languages. The UWC mission expresses its gratitude to the individuals, educational institutions, and non-profit organizations that generously provided their expertise, services, technical and logistical support, including lodging and transportation. The UWC mission expresses its gratitude to the UCCA election observation mission for its cooperation and the UWC mission group coordinators and youth organization, schema, and UWC mission expresses gratitude to all its donors that enabled its work. The UWC mission expresses its gratitude to Ukrainian people for their hospitality during its work, particularly on the 21st of July, on the day of monitoring of the parliamentary election in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions. Dear guests, please introduce yourself first. Good afternoon. Makuruk Mikhailo. I'm a speaker of Inform Napalm organization. You've mentioned experience of Estonia, and this is relevant for Ukraine because in Estonia 1 million and we have more than 40 million. So about internet voting, you said that this is great, but internet voting cannot be provided because there is secrecy of voting. This contradicts Constitution of Ukraine. This is first issue. About legitimacy of such voting, if you lobby and you do it now, you didn't study our legislation laws. Also, you've mentioned 3 social media networks and 1 platform, WhatsApp. Why do you do not know about social media in Ukraine? You didn't include YouTube and communication, Telegram. You didn't mention Viber. I have an impression that our diaspora is not really connected to Ukrainian reality. They do not know about it. Why Ukrainian World Congress in 5 years of Russian-Ukrainian war did not make efforts to highlight the facts of presence of Russian forces in Donbass and also other paramilitary Russian structures that are present in Donbass. About your first question, we do not lobby for internet voting. We provided the information about the ways how it may be done, and Ukrainian authorities should do that, and missions, international missions should analyze this. They should study the examples that exist in the world, and they should deliberate this issue, and this would help to increase the number of people who vote outside Ukraine. In the course of presidential elections, only 13% voted, and parliamentary elections, only 14% voted. And in Canada, you may vote in Edmonton, in Ottawa, and in Toronto. I cited during one press conference that there was one family that really wanted to vote, and they flew by plane from British Columbia to Edmonton. And after voting, they came back, and this happened 3 times, 2 times during presidential elections, first and second round, and during parliamentary elections. Some people in Kazakhstan went for a day to vote. And we believe that taking into account such a situation, authority structures in Ukraine, authority bodies. So I was taught in diaspora that if someone raises the issue, then he should hear the response. So they should not interrupt each other. People should not interrupt each other. About social media, you say that I do not know social media in Ukraine. And you show that you were late to this press conference. You didn't hear this. I reported on this, about disinformation, how it was disseminated through the media outside Ukraine. Our mission was the only mission that observed the level of disinformation that existed outside Ukraine. That's why I quoted social networks that were used outside Ukraine in order to continue to provide this information. They say that Ukraine is a failed state. And in Ukraine, there was a number of expert organizations that dealt with the issues of disinformation in Ukraine. Ukrainian World Congress has a big network, 60 countries of the world where we have our organizations, and we dealt with this issue. That's why I quoted social media, social networks that were used in diaspora. You didn't. You thought that I do not know social media inside Ukraine, but I know about them. I just mentioned foreign media because it was relevant in this context. So Ukrainian diaspora in these 5 years, you said that we didn't provide information about it, but you do not understand elementary things, and you provide wrong arguments. Today, Ukraine uses big help of Canada, USA, European Union, and huge sums of money are provided to help in humanitarian, military, and technical areas. This is done due to those Ukrainians who live in those countries and call on governmental structures in those countries, not in words, not in mottos, but to help Ukraine to protect territorial integrity. So your argument shows that Ukrainians like you should get more interest in the activity of UWC and diaspora in order to not to provide such false declarations. Please look on, address the site of UWC, and we have a report. And there is a report for 5 years of our activity, and you may get information about huge work that was done not only by UWC, but also what our network did in order to help Ukraine. And we have a Future Defense Project and other projects that we implemented during this time. Other question. Andrei Megel, Information Agency, Inform. You've mentioned decision of Prosecutor's General Office of Russian Federation and how things changed. What did you do to somehow respond to the situation? Thank you for your question. We provided this issue to our lawyers, and they study the best ways how to resolve this issue. To go to Russian courts, but we know about the results. In this case, if we file to Russian courts, we will file to the court in Strasbourg, or at once to file to Strasbourg court at once. This issue was analyzed, and we will have meetings soon. We will deal with these issues during our meetings that we'll have in the nearest future. And I know that you communicated with our state bodies concerning cooperation in monitoring elections and monitoring of the media. Do you plan to continue cooperation, and what are the recommendations for concerning help in the sphere of media monitoring and fighting disinformation? After parliamentary elections, our preliminary conclusions were voiced and provided to governmental bodies. The results of our long-term monitoring and response was positive, and there was interest, and we are interested in cooperation. They got the materials, and in the nearest future I will meet officials in order to speak about our future cooperation. Do you have other questions? If there are no, thank you for your attention, and see you soon. Thank you.